Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hi, everybody, and welcome to What is Magic? This is the third class in Horizon Lodge's O.T.O 101 series. In this class, I'm going to attempt to clearly and succinctly describe what is magic and its different types in a Thelemic context, how it's relevant to Thelema, and that is really what is Thelemic magic. What is the purpose of doing magic, particularly in that Thelemic context? And those first three are all kind of really intimately related. And a little bit about how do you get started and how Thelemic magic relates to other traditions that you may or may not be familiar with. I'm not going to attempt to teach you any sort of particular rituals or any practice. This isn't that kind of class. This is really more like an introduction to, like, if you're a Thelemite and you're interested in this, why might you want to do it? We may produce some short videos like that in the future, but that's not the goal of today. I'd also like to point out that since this class is mostly aimed at beginners and people who are new either to magic or magic in a Thelemic context, and since the goals are to communicate our concepts without excessive jargon, there will be some spots where I'm presenting maybe a more intuitive explanation than a precise technical one. So instead of aiming to be more precise than helpful, I'm going to aim to be helpful before precise. That's by design. I'm just trying to give people like a helpful grounding in magical concepts in a Thelemic milieu. And you'll notice I'm not doing a PowerPoint this time. I've decided I don't like doing those. So you get to look at my face, I guess. All right. So since this class is being presented by an O.T.O body, I'm almost obligated to quote Crowley's definition in Magic in Theory and Practice. I'm not technically obligated to, but I will anyway. He writes, "Magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will." At first blush, this definition seems maybe a little bit too cute and maybe almost useless, since, as Crowley points out on the very next page, this implies that every intentional act is a magical act. Thanks, Crowley. End of talk, I guess. Just kidding. Let's back up a little bit from there and recall that when he says cause change to occur in conformity with will, that in Thelema, will is a really special concept. And so special, in fact, that that's almost kind of a silly thing to say, because Thelema just means will in Greek. And so if we consider the centrality of the concept of will in Thelema, and therefore to Crowley's writings on magic, this definition that is at first maybe not very helpful starts to make a little bit more sense. Remember that in Thelema, when we talk about will, particularly when it's capitalized, so the big will, we're not talking about like some momentary whim or desire, like I could really go for some nachos right now. It's not even a more long-term goal, like I want to learn the trumpet or I want to learn French, no matter how lofty or laudable that goal may be. Instead, will is something deep and intrinsic to you and to your nature. It's some inevitable fact about you, maybe the inevitable fact, an unavoidable fact about you. And it's a statement about you and the path that you are traveling through time and space, so to speak. Your hunger for nachos and your desire to play the trumpet may be expressions of that will and of that truth about you, but they are not themselves that truth. There are people who would disagree with the statement I just made, or at least they would object that I don't have any right to tell you what is or is not your will. And that objection has a little bit of a point. I don't necessarily know you, and even if I do, I certainly don't know that deep truth about you that I'm referring to as your will. However, I bet that, if the supermarket was closed and you were really hungry, you'd find, and you didn't have any chips, you'd find some other way to satisfy your hunger. And if you had some dental injury, so you couldn't create an embouchure, you'd find some other way to express yourself in sound. And so that's what I mean that these desires are expressions of a more fundamental fact about you. And it's that deep fact about you that we're referring to when we say magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Just a few pages later, Crowley writes that there is a single main definition of the object of all magical ritual. This is cool. It is the uniting of the microcosm with the macrocosm. The supreme and complete ritual is therefore the invocation of the holy guardian angel, or, in the language of mysticism, union with God. And later, the single supreme ritual is the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. It is the raising of the complete man in a straight line. He also writes in the chapter on the wand in Magick that any will but to give up the self to the beloved is black magic. He explains elsewhere that other operations are sometimes necessary to support this work or to achieve this purpose. But in Crowley's conception of magic, and therefore in Thelemic magic, this is always the ultimate goal. This is where you're going. And so I think that finally puts us in a position to provide a more useful definition of magic when we have that understanding of will, right? It's not just what I want. So I'm going to take a swag at it. Let's say that magic is a spiritual practice that uses ritual and other means to cause the development of the individual and their environment in accordance with their will, that is, with their true nature. I think that between ritual and other means and the individual and their environment, this still includes literally everything, like Crowley's definition, but it kind of breaks it out in such a manner that it's a little more on the nose about what people are actually talking about when they talk about magic, right? Because typically eating nachos isn't magic. So you know that I like doing this. So let's break this down a little bit by bit, and see what we can learn from kind of that process. Let's start with magic is a spiritual practice to cause the development of the individual and environment in accordance with their will. This speaks to the purpose of magic, and it also kind of makes clear what it's not. Magic is a spiritual practice. We're not talking about, we're not talking about magic missile here, pulling rabbits out of hats. And it's not necessarily even just doing a spell once for money. And its ultimate goal is union of the individual with God, as Crowley said. And I think it's useful here to just leave what God means in this context deliberately vague. Crowley did the same when he called one of the goals of this Thelemic spiritual path knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So if he could do that with knowledge and conversation, I could do it with God and just use one word. If you decide that you need to do a ritual because you need money or because you want to find a romantic partner or whatever, that is supposed to serve this ultimate purpose in this Thelemic context. For instance, we have a ritual called Will, somewhat annoyingly named because it's this name of Will, that we perform before meals to remind you that your delicious nachos serve that higher purpose, right? So in Thelemic magic, everything is supposed to point and contribute towards this end goal. This also helps to explain how the ends more traditionally associated with magical practice, love, money, chips covered with cheese, may fit into a Thelemic magical path. You might need to get some money so you can continue to pursue union with God. If you don't have a roof over your head, that's hard. What makes an end good or bad is whether it serves this ultimate goal. about the ritual and other means bit? One of Crowley's key contributions to magical technique was the insight that contemplative methods, like yoga or meditation, were traditionally associated with Eastern religions, and the ritual techniques of Western magic work really well together. Ritual also plays really nicely with more aesthetic or artistic methods and pursuits like like music or painting or drama or food or what have you. And that makes sense, right? Because union with God is a pretty big goal. Citation needed, I know. And it's unrealistic to think that you're going to accomplish that with, I don't know, like 20 minutes of ritual work each day. So if you could get all of your other senses and the emotions associated with them, like kind of driving towards that goal as well, and just kind of harness that engine, then that's, really good. So if we put all that together, you can see that magic, as I'm describing it here, is a practice that uses ritual and meditation and really anything else you can find lying about to attain union with God, whatever that means. And again, when I say whatever that means, I'm not trying to be flip. I'm deliberately sidestepping the question of what union with God means, because that could really easily derail any sort of productive discussion. And if we leave it vague, then you probably have a good enough idea, more or less what I mean. And trying to nail down God, does not lead to edification, it leads to Christianity. And so, yeah, magic is a spiritual practice in Thelema that strives to union with God. And I want to stop for a minute and point out that what I'm describing specifically is Thelemic magic, and specifically the kind of magic associated with a Thelemic spiritual path. And by path, I mean, like, sometimes people just say that, like, what's your spiritual path? But like, a path takes you from point A to point Z, right? You're going somewhere. It's not just sightseeing. And the point Z in Thelemic magic is knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel. It is union with God. It is uniting the microcosm with the macrocosm. There is actually a goal. And sometimes people will say Thelemic magic, and they just mean using rituals that Crowley wrote, or that have Thelemic deities in them, or something like that. I guess that's an okay way to look at it, right? Like, that is kind of Thelemic magic too. I just don't find that nearly as interesting. I find it much more insightful to look at this kind of big picture as like, what is this for? Like, where does this presume you're starting from, or where you're going to? As opposed to saying like, well, if it says Nuit and Hadith, then that must be Thelemic, because there are definitely rituals that have Nuit and Hadith in them that don't have this kind of particular striving for them. And then if you're just talking about like which names are in the ritual, that can lead to incoherence. It's totally possible to do magic with a Thelemic intent, but use gods from some other pantheon. Crowley certainly did. And it's equally possible to use Thelemic god names while maintaining that same sense of separation between yourself and the divine that we're actually trying to destroy. It's the Jehovah and drag syndrome. We don't want that. All that being said, so while Thelemic magic is more about the goal than the means, like the means can vary. It's very experimental. It's very open-minded and open-ended. You can kind of make some generalizations about Thelemic magical practice. It does tend to use Thelemic deities, because that just kind of makes sense. I mean, like, if you're using, not to pick on Christianity, but if you're using like Jesus, like, that's not what Jesus is about. And so you're going to have to like kind of work against the grain a little bit there. But Thelema does feel free, or I should say Thelemites do feel free to draw from other pantheons when it suits your purpose. There's even a book of tables that correlates deities from different pantheons, and like called 777. And if you look at it as a work of anthropology, It's terrible, but it's pretty helpful if you want to write a ritual that is, martial or Venusian or Jupiterian. You can use 777 to do that. That kind of approach comes from Crowley's Golden Dawn days. If you could, a lot of Crowley's magic rituals and does come from the Golden Dawn. If you compare Crowley's rituals to the Golden Dawn rituals, like the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, you can really see that very clearly. Thelemic magical practice is very open to experimentation. There's a really important emphasis on keeping a diary, like a record of your results, like what you do. I tried this, these were the conditions, this was the result. And so that kind of leads to a, well, let's just try it and see attitude, right? It's science. And that also makes magic into more of a creative act instead of a like interpretive act, so to speak. If I don't like the way that the star ruby works, I could make modifications and just see how that goes. We'd try different techniques. We could try different media. You can see stuff like this on Horizon's YouTube page. We have rituals that are just straight up like almost a movie, and then things where it's a video meant to help you scry a particular spirit. And I'm really proud of the work that we have up there because it's a great example of that kind of creative and experimental aspect of Thelemic magical praxis. In Liber O, Crowley even writes, these rituals, the ones in Liber O, need not be slavishly imitated. On the contrary, the student should do nothing the object of which he does not understand. Also, if he have any capacity whatever, he will find his own crude rituals more effective than the highly polished ones of other people, end quote. I take that that's really an encouragement to go for it and try things out. And that makes sense, right? At a really fundamental level, if you write your own ritual, you've already invested that much time and thought and emotion into it. It means something personal to you right from the get-go, as opposed to if you're doing, say the star ruby, you have to build that emotional connection as opposed to like having it built into the ritual itself because you wrote it. All that being said, it's still really useful to use pre-written rituals when you're starting out. It's like if you're learning a language, you have example sentences in your language book. You might not ever use that exact phrase ever in like your real life. You might, but you might not, but that's not the point. The point is that it kind of helps you understand the structure of the language. It helps you build a vocabulary and like, okay, well, I can say this way, and I can modify it to say this other thing, this other way. And so, yeah, learning, if you're just starting out, people who are just starting out, I recommend that you do, before you go and write your own stuff, try some of someone else's stuff. My unpopular advice, but I think the best advice, is just to go and read Liber O. That's Crowley's basic book of ritual instruction. It's like 5 or 6 pages. The language is kind of sparse, and it doesn't walk you through everything as thoroughly as you might want. But there's actually a benefit to that, or I can think of 2 at least. One is that there's not a lot of extra nonsense in there that someone else added to like the original material that they just kind of thought up. Because people like come up with these things where like, okay, when you're doing the ritual of the pentagram, you imagine yourself being taller than the universe. And it's like, okay, man, like that's cool. And so you could get away from that kind of extravagance to what are the actual physical actions I'm going to take, and try to figure out what the physical actions you're going to take are. How am I going to wave my arms around? What are the words I'm going to say? And then kind of go from there to your own understanding of the mental process that you're performing. The other is that it teaches you to read and think about ritual scripts, because that's a skill all its own. They can be kind of difficult and are often sparse because people just assume things. And so if you get into the habit of reading between the lines of ritual scripts, that's a good place to start. I'll go ahead and post a link to that in the chat when I'm done with this. So it is a little bit intimidating at first, but if you read it bit by bit, in particular that first section that doesn't seem terribly relevant, but really is, and you just give it a try, you'll figure it out, I promise. Horizon will be producing some short videos in the next few months to kind of demonstrate some of these rituals with minimal editorializing, where it's just like, here's how you do the thing. But in the meantime, if you say a word wrong, I promise you won't get zapped. Just make sure to take notes and so you recall what you did. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope this has been helpful. I acknowledge right now that this has been a little bit more scattered than my previous presentation. It's a big subject, and I wanted to talk about enough without going on too long. So, and to leave lots of room for questions at the end. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have to the best of my ability at this point. Love is a law, love under will. Is it necessary to do magic in Thelema? That's actually a pretty good question, Mary. I think people are going to disagree with me on this, and that's okay. I think it depends on what you mean by in Thelema, right? Like, I think that there's the law of Thelema that is, do what thou wilt. All that means about like expressing your own true nature and letting other people do that. I don't think that it's necessary to do magic for that, right? The law, as it says in the book of the law, is for all, right? But I think that if you're talking about the Thelemic spiritual path, getting from that point A to that point Z, then, okay, so that is what you're talking about. Yeah, I think that for some value of magic, it is necessary to do magic. Yeah, I think that if you are supposing, if your premise is that there is something that you are not that you want to be, there has to be some method to make that happen, right? You have to do a thing. Otherwise, you would already be that thing that you want to be. And that thing that you have to do, that is magic. And it could be like kind of anything, right? Magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. But it has, you have to do a thing and it has to accomplish the goal. Then that's magic.
Are you all right with me throwing something into the mix?
Yeah, certainly.
So I think that, one way to think about magic in the context of Thelema is that Crowley tends to talk about it in two ways. One of them, I think, roughly corresponds with a having mode, and the other corresponds with a being mode. So he talks about magic in terms of making contact with higher spiritual entities, right? So, for example, the holy guardian angel would be such a being, or spirits that you evoke or invoke, or making contact with certain kinds of energies, for example, the solar energy when doing Resh, or the sort of 93 current when doing Liber Reguli or something like that. That's the idea of success as your proof, and taking that kind of empirical attitude toward magic in terms of interpreting it in terms of results would all sort of fall into that. And then on the other hand, he has another definition of it, which is more like the definition from Magic in Theory and Practice, where it's about the will expressing itself. And I think of that as more of being like the being mode. And that's not so much about achieving any particular end result. That's more about every act, every kind of engagement, every kind of participation in the world is a kind of magic. And it's really about connecting the depth of yourself with the depth of the universe, and really kind of working with that energetic life flow or that life force in a very open-ended way without any kind of particular end result. And that's more of like a way in terms of like the Tao, I think of it. And so that second kind of magic, Crowley says, you can't help but do that. So you may as well know, you may as well learn how to do it well. So in that sense, it's even bigger than if you're a Thelemite, right? Everybody's doing magic all the time. And Thelema is kind of like a specialized way of harnessing that life connection and that life energy. So I think when it comes to the question of, do you have to, is it necessary to do magic in Thelema? It depends which sense you're using the word magic in, because if you're using it in the second sense, then you have no choice, whether you're Thelemite or not, you're doing it. In terms of the first sense of doing like evocation and making contact with entities, for certain expressions of Thelema, I think that's definitely true. You'll definitely do that if you are in AA, for example. But if you don't share that particular, if you're not interested in that particular path, then perhaps not. You would not necessarily be interested in that particular way of doing magic. So yeah, that'd be my 2 cents for that.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that. John asks, once said thing is accomplished, is it necessary to continue reaching further? Basically, after reaching Z, does one need to work on AA to keep said results? That's a good question. I can't answer that from the standpoint of AA because I'm not in DAA. But Crowley says in many places that, after you reach once you attain knowledge and conversation, that all the I think he meant starting over the alphabet. Thank you. Okay. Got it. Well, I think that what I was going to say probably still stands. Different AA. Okay. That Crowley talks about once you attain knowledge and conversation, that the holy guardian angel is your teacher, right? And that you'd have no need of further instruction. I don't think that means that you won't have anything to do, but it does probably mean that you'll know what to do, if that makes sense. That being said, I think it is likely that, yes, you would need to continue some sort of practice, because if the default state of human beings were united with God, then you would not need to practice to begin with.
To clarify something that you said earlier, you mentioned certain like elaborations on the techniques of Liber O, where people say that you have to be like as tall as a building or whatever, or you have to visualize X, Y, or Z. I would say that I would be wary of anyone who tells you that you have to visualize yourself doing something in a certain way. For some people, certain visualizations are going to be enormously helpful, and for others, they aren't. But if you look at that original document, Liber O, which is really, in my opinion, it's quite comprehensive, even if it doesn't go into all the details of everything. I see that as being sort of the bare bones that you need, and you can elaborate almost endlessly on any of it in there.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. That I would not at all say that you shouldn't visualize or that it's never going to be useful. Just that, if you look at the text is, you go O.T.O and well, good. It's there's nothing in the text about shooting fireballs.
I could throw something else in just from a practical perspective. I think that anything that aids in absorption is enormously helpful when doing magic. I find that my magic is best when I'm the most absorbed in what I'm doing. So figuring out whatever mechanisms of absorption work best for you to get a good, strong visualization, or a good, strong out-of-body experience, or a good, strong body of light, experience. For some people, chanting works really, really well with that, or doing some meditation beforehand, or any number of other things. I would say that's probably one of the most important factors, and just from a practical perspective when doing this stuff.
Yeah. And other means are very important. Okay. Okay, Enrique, I'm gonna just answer these in the order they have, so I could go to John's first. Working with evoking or invoking, is that considered outside the law, as in rules man must follow? Essentially, is that more of a form of chaos magic? I'm not totally clear on what you're asking. I don't think that that is outside of any sort of law. I mean, so in terms of the law of Thelema, the question is, does that fulfill, is it according to your will, right? Like, is it according to your, to that deep fact about you that is your will? There are certainly reasons to evoke or invoke in a Thelemic context. John, let me know if I didn't answer it. What I mean is it outside of our control? Hopefully not.
It's not going to happen by accident.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely requires intent. Invoking without control sounds dangerous. Yes. Yeah, I'm gonna go on to Enrique's question, and John, if I didn't answer your question, let me know. Maybe some time to type a response. So, are there magical artifacts in Thelema? For instance, if you have a journal, as you say, would putting your records of practice, desires, and intentions make it to a point magical? I mean, yeah, like for me, right? It my journals have tremendous meaning and magical efficacy for me. If I if I gave you my journal, I would be sad, and that would be a foolish thing for me to do, because it would be giving away something that's of great benefit to me and of no use to you. You'd be like, this is just like paper. Does that make sense? I think that it's yeah, it is deeply personal. It's like, when you get a thing that's like a coupon and it says not transferable. that's what a magical artifact is like.
Most magicians have magical weapons that they consecrate by whatever means they feel is appropriate.
Yeah. Most important is use. That answers in the, okay. No, there is not really a difference in the way the laws work. The universe is as we find it. If the laws work differently in one system or the other, it's because they're either one of them, because they're formulated differently, or one of them is wrong, or both of them are wrong. But the universe does not change because you're a Thelemite or a chaos magician.
If one already has some kind of magical practice, but they're interested in moving like more of a Thelemic bent, what would be required there? Like, how would one get started with it?
That's a good question, Jim. I haven't thought about that a lot, because I was a Thelemite before I started doing magic. I guess that my off-the-cuff answer would be continue doing what you're doing and evaluate what the purpose is. Is it serving that purpose or of union with God? And if it is, continue, and if it is not, adjust. If it's that method of science thing, right? You can make incremental changes and see if it works. You could also just try doing some of Crowley's rituals and see how if that feels different. But I think that the intent, the elimination of the separation between yourself and deity is the important thing. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And this should be on YouTube in a few days. We'll have another class in 2 weeks presented by Jim here on what is a Thelemic church. I'm looking forward to that because should be good. Thank you very much. Good night.